Okay, it is now 7:30. We will get started with our talk on Paintbrushes in Peril by Mark Egger. This is a presentation by the California Native Plant Society chapter in the Santa Clara Valley. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge that all the work done by the Santa Clara Valley chapter lies in the homeland of the Muwekma Ohlone, the Ama Mutsun tribal band, the Tamian Nation, and the Ramaytush Ohlone. This land was theirs for thousands of years, but was taken from them forcibly. Despite 2 centuries of oppression and genocide, they still live and thrive in this area today. We acknowledge and respect them for their land stewardship, culture, language, and humanity. The Santa Clara Valley chapter of CNPS hopes to learn from them and support their work to restore traditional practices and heal from historical trauma. And welcome to everyone who's here tonight, especially if this is your first talk. We would love to know how you found out about us and where you are. Please share in the chat if you are willing. These talks are put on by a team. I am your host, Madeline Morrow. Our question and answer moderator is Judy Fennerty. Our YouTube moderator is Kelvin Liu, and our tech is Vivian New. And of course, our main speaker tonight is Mark Egger, and we also have a student, Emma Fryer, who will be making a short presentation. And if you don't know about CNPS, it is a nonprofit environmental organization dating back to 1965. Right now, it has over 10,000 members in 35 chapters spread all over California and Baja California. The Santa Clara Valley chapter covers Santa Clara and southern San Mateo counties. The CNPS mission is to save California native plants and habitats, bringing together science, education, conservation, and gardening to power the native plant movement. If you'd like to be a part of this movement, we would welcome your support. You would help conserve California's native plant diversity by joining CNPS. And membership benefits include 2 journals, Artemisia, a science journal, Flora General Readership, although articles in both journals are accessible. I don't have a strong science background, and I find Artemisia very interesting. You also get our Blazing Star chapter newsletter. There's members-only events and activities and discounts at various nurseries. And so to join, all you have to do is navigate to cnps.org/join. Our chapter gets pretty much all of its funds from our native plant nursery. Right now, which is at Hidden Villa, so right now we have restricted summer sales. If you order online for $250 or more, we will deliver plants if you live between Belmont and San Jose. As I said, all proceeds benefit CNPS, Santa Clara Valley chapter. In addition to plants, we have t-shirts from our Growing Natives Garden Tour, books, signs, etc. And you check our Square site to see what plants we have. The inventory changes regularly, so it's good to check. There's the website on the screen, but you can also just visit our website at cnps-scv.org and look for the gardening with natives tab, the gardening tab. In addition to this talk, we have lots more talks coming up. Next week, talk on climate change, what works and what you can do by Elaine Solinger next Wednesday at 7:30. We have our monthly photography group show and tell on Friday the 27th at 7 p.m. This is an informal sharing of photos. If you just like looking at great photos or want to start showing some of your own, we invite you to join this program. Talks in September include Birds in the Garden. There's a virtual garden tour on September 8th. And then the distinctive landscape of Blue Oak Ranch Reserve on September 15th. And there'll be more talks ongoing. So all of these events are listed on our website, cnps-scb.com, or on meetup.com, and they're announced weekly on the chapter news mailing list. How do you get on the chapter news mailing list? You send an email to this address to subscribe, or you can just go to our website and there's a button there to join the newsletter, to join the news group. And we only send announcements. It's you will not be inundated, and you stay up to date with all the events that we have going on. And if you're enjoying these virtual talks, we have we're interested in getting more people to vary the teams. Our Q&A moderator presents viewer questions. This one you're speaking on camera. And the YouTube moderator copies questions from YouTube to Zoom chat. You don't have to speak. You don't have to have your video on. And the qualifications are pretty simple. You have to be comfortable using a keyboard and mouse and switching windows, copying and pasting. And if you're interested in helping, you can contact me. I'm coordinating volunteers for the tech teams at Madeline Morrow at earthlink.net. And just a housekeeping note on how we do our talks. Please make sure your microphones are muted. Type your questions or comments in the chat box at any time. Our Q&A moderator will make sure that those questions get to our speaker. We expect to finish by 9 p.m. and we're simulcasting this program on YouTube, and it will be available for later viewing. So if you really like the talk and you want to get your friends to watch it, you can send them a link to our YouTube channel. It will appear shortly after the talk is finished. So our first presenter tonight is Emma Fryer from California Polytechnic, San Luis Obispo. She's our Sally Casey Shooting Stars Graduate Research Scholarship recipient. And her talk is on Community Assembly of Vertic Clay Endemic Annuals of the San Joaquin Desert. Well, that's her project, and she's going to give you an overview of that. So we'll turn it over to Emma.
Hi, everyone. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you're all seeing my slides. Anyone?
Looks good.
Awesome. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to be presenting on my thesis project that this chapter has pretty substantially supported. My thesis is focused on the community assembly of the vertic clay endemic annual plants of the San Joaquin Desert. Excuse me. I believe my co-advisor, one of my committee members, Ryan O'Dell, presented to this chapter a few months ago. And so some of you may recall that the San Joaquin Desert, while having an arid climate and desert soils and a lot of desert features, wasn't really recognized until recently as a desert. And this late recognition was due to early invasion of non-native annual grasses and the rapid and almost complete conversion of most of the lands in the Central Valley for ag, fossil fuel extraction and development. Early ecological work had presumed that it was a degraded perennial grassland, but historical records indicate that the region was previously dominated by annual forbs. So it was much more like similar to Carrizo Plain and not quite so much brome. So despite the dominance of annual grasses in the region, today at least, the San Joaquin Desert has a very distinctive native annual flora that's persisted almost half of which are rare and which contains a lot of species that are endemic to the region. And the San Joaquin Desert flora may be best known for Carrizo Plain, where several of my study species have become famous for super blooms in the past decade. And despite the sometimes overwhelming attention of the public that the super blooms attract, much of this flora isn't really known to the public, even those living in the region. I grew up in the valley and I was not aware of it until I started working as a field biologist. So the verdict clay soils that my plants grow on are very extreme soils for plants to live in for multiple reasons. They're over 50% clay particles, and these are smectite clays specifically, which are the super absorbent kind of clay that they make kitty litter out of. So imagine growing a plant in that. And so that really affects water dynamics, because this clay content of the specific type of clay means that there's cracking caused by the clay's tendency to expand a bunch when it's wet and to shrink a bunch when it's dry, which you can see in the middle photo. At some of my field sites, that feature means that there are cracks in the soil at some sites that were 2 feet deep, almost 3 feet, 18 inches wide. And this, even just looking at the photo on the right, suggests that this presents some challenge for plants following rain and then as it dries out over the spring. And these soils are also chemically stressful. They're high in selenium and sodium. They tend to be somewhat poorly developed and shallow at a lot of my field sites. So overall, these are really, really remarkably chemically, physically extreme soils. And this is in an already challenging desert climate. So the species that I'm studying from this flora are present at 2 field sites with these soils, at Cantua Creek and at Carrizo Plain National Monument. These species are all endemic or nearly endemic to verdict clay soils in the San Joaquin Desert. Many of them are rare, and several are found only in the San Joaquin Desert. Their restriction, or at least in some cases preference, for verdict clay soils has gone more or less unexplored. And all of these study species are found at either one or both of my field sites. Where something that really stands out, which you can see in this photo, is that there's very dramatic heterogeneity in the verdict clay soils. So this is all verdict clay soil, but you can see that there's distinct patchiness to it. And if you go when these species are in bloom, they form these distinct patterns that really reflect the pattern of soils, and which preliminary data from the Bureau of Land Management suggests does actually follow the soils. So my project's goal is to create a model for this community's assembly. How did we get it? So how do we get from a presumably large pool of potential colonizing species, given the diversity of the surrounding regions, this is California, to the verdict clay endemic flora that we see there today? So I'm looking at the most likely environmental factors, which are filtering out possible colonizer species from outside the region, and defining the fundamental niche of any species not filtered out, so where those species could live. I'm also addressing a biotic factor, which filters out more species and reduces that fundamental niche for those remaining species down to a realized niche. So to see if this model holds, I've conducted 3 different controlled outdoor pot studies, greenhouse studies without the greenhouse, which I just wrapped up in June. And once I began this project in the middle of COVID last fall, I wound up doing these studies in a friend's backyard in Fresno in the Central Valley. So it was a San Joaquin Desert climate, similar to that at my field sites, almost exactly, and where these species are normally found. So these pot studies addressed abiotic and biotic factors that might be acting on this community, and these are informed guesses. So start with the abiotic factors to determine the role of the soil chemistry, which I already went over a bit. I planted these 12 species, which are native to soils of varying degrees of chemical harshness at my field sites, across 3 different soils that were collected for me from the field by Ryan O'Dell, who's been fantastic, which make up a gradient of chemical stress, which is present at my field sites, so that we can see how these 12 species respond to the different levels of chemical stress found in these clay soils where these plants grow. But to address a second abiotic factor in soil texture, I took 5 verdict clay endemic species, the ones on freeze up, let me know where I left off. I took these 5 verdict clay endemic species to address soil texture that had a congener or sister species that's native to a differently textured soil, which is also found in the San Joaquin Desert. So the ones on the bottom are all found from sandy, sandy textured soils. So I planted both of those species in both the verdict clay soil and the congener species sandy or native soil, and those soils were collected from appropriate sites for those species. So with those two pot studies that are addressing abiotic factors that might be shaping the fundamental niche, the next step for building this model that I have planned would be to narrow that fundamental niche down to the realized niche. So to do that, I added a biotic factor. I took that soil chemistry study and I repeated it, but with added competition from invasive annual grasses, which are common at my field sites. We all know bromes. Not native bromes anyway. Data from that is hopefully going to let me determine whether competition is reducing performance, and if so, if that effect differs across soil chemistry types or like features of the soil. So my hope had been to present at least preliminary results to you all today. Unfortunately, these pot studies and the subsequent data collection have been an enormous time commitment. This time lapse is over like almost an hour, I think. And even with the help that I've had from my fantastic, very hardworking undergrads, Alyssa and Skylar here on the left, I'm still collecting data. And so instead, I'm going to try to summarize my plans for all this data, and hopefully I'll be able to provide an update for you all soon. So I hadn't originally planned on it, but I wound up taking the opportunity to collect phenology data. So I had almost 400 pots of 19 species with really difficult soils, and it was hard to pass up. So I counted the flowers that were open on each plant every day, as well as the total number of flowers for each plant over its lifetime, when it bloomed, when it germinated, when it died. And once those plants senesced, I collected the above ground vegetation, and then I rinsed all of the clay soils off of the roots by hand. So all of my biomass results and tissue analyses will be able to be differentiated between the root and the shoot of the plant, which should help to let me kind of look at the physiological mechanisms that of tolerance to the chemical stress in these soils. So with data collected from that soil chemistry study, we'll be able to compare performance for each of these 12 species across the 3 soil types to determine their fundamental niche, as well as phenology across those same soil types. So that'll let us determine if the soil's chemical properties are affecting reproductive success or causing reproductive isolation, which could lead to speciation. And with plant tissue elemental analyses and corresponding soil analyses, we should be able to figure out the physiological mechanism of tolerance for those soils. The competition version of that soil chemistry study with the added grasses should let me determine what the realized niche for each species is, so just narrowing down from the last one. Most of the data is going to be the same metrics as in the non-competition version, but we'll have biomass of the invasive grasses as well, which can be compared to the native plant biomass, and hopefully also serve as a measure of the competitive pressure that's possible. We can also compare each species' performance and the phenology, the timing of flowering and life events in the plant's life cycle across the soil types, except we can compare them with and without competition. And so hopefully get more resolution for the combined effect of these abiotic and biotic factors. So see how much that fundamental niche actually differs from the realized niche, and how much these invasive grasses, which are pervasive, are affecting these native species. And then for the soil texture study, I'll be comparing the performance of the congener pairs across soil textures to determine whether texture alone, so exclusive of the really extreme soil chemistry that we see at most of my sites, if the texture alone is an abiotic factor that's acting on this community as well. Comparing the phenology in the same manner as in the other studies should let me see if the phenological changes that occur, if flowering windows shift, if those might occur from changes in soil texture alone that could lead to reproductive isolation over time. So is soil texture on its own enough to cause speciation? Lastly, my ongoing field studies will provide data on species presence at each of the species patches I showed you photos of, which you can see better here after a good rain year. Specifically, I'm collecting data on species composition for each patch, as well as the patch's slope and aspect. So soil samples from each species patch will allow me to correlate soil properties with the species composition at those patches. And my hope is that, rain permitting, field studies will let me kind of ground truth the results that they get from those pot studies, since these are the same species, both in the field and the pot studies. And hopefully to do so while incorporating slope and aspect. And that in particular should be interesting to do, because while the clay soils on Carrizo Plain are found on the flat valley floor, the clay soils at Quintua Creek are on varying slopes and aspects, sometimes very steep. And I'm hoping to get to compare the two in that regard. So it's through this combination of the pot studies that I've just wrapped up and the field studies I'll be concluding this year that I'm hoping to get a clearer picture of this community, and not only of its community assembly, how we got it, but also insight into the nature of vertic clay endemism. How do they live in these really difficult soils and texture alone? And if all that phenology data was in fact worth counting thousands of flowers a day, hopefully I'll also get some insight into how these species become restricted to these soils in the first place. Thank you all for your attention. And once again, thank you so much for your chapter's support. This has been an enormous project, and I've been very, very fortunate. I could never have gotten this far without help from a lot of wonderful people and really generous organizations. And especially in very difficult times, I'm very grateful. And so I'm hoping that I'll get to update everyone on the results of this summer's slightly longer than expected period of data collection. And if you like, you are welcome to follow me as I progress with the research. I'll hopefully have a lot more posted on my site soon. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Emma. That's wonderful, and so great to hear all that research you're able to complete, even though it's been such a dry year. And I know we look forward to seeing some of those plants again in person, and hopefully it's a damp year. But we have a couple of questions if you have a minute for you.
Yeah, definitely.
So do you know other places that have vertic clay soils that you're aware of? Have you looked in other regions or continents?
There's not a ton that are identical, at least to it, like high resolution of like soil features. I have seen photos from a place in Utah, and I can email that to someone if they want to know where, that are essentially the same, shockingly similar. There are sites throughout South America, but overall, these are actually really rare soils in general. They were only described in, I think, the 80s. And they're pretty unique. So the fact that we have multiple sites in California is pretty cool. It's not all serpentine. But the only one in the US I'm aware of at the moment is in Utah. But if someone wanted me to email them what I know, I could certainly pass that along.
Sure. And could you just clarify again what sodic soils are?
High in sodium, because it's not always sodium chloride salt. It's sometimes different forms of sodium. Sometimes it's just the ions. So thinking of it as salty soil is reasonable, but it's just like a technical distinction.
Yes. So we also had some thank yous and saying it's great work, but also as we had a comment from one of our friends, as a chemist, I learned there's no such thing as a failed experiment, just negative results. I don't know if that helps or not.
I remind myself of that, right?
All right. Well, I'm sure this, I think you were awarded the Sally Casey Scholarship, Shooting Star Scholarship, and I know she would have enjoyed this kind of presentation very much. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Madeline, on next.
Okay. And that brings us to our main speaker tonight, Mark Egger, speaking about paintbrushes in peril, rare Castellaia species of North America. And Mark Egger is a retired science educator, a research associate at the WTU Herbarium in Seattle, and he is a member of CNPS, the Washington Native Plant Society, and the Native Plant Society of Oregon. He's published numerous papers and flora treatments for the Castellaia genus, including a number of new species and varieties. and he's the lead author for Castilleja in the recently published volume 17 of the Flora of North America. He also maintains a Flickr site with over 56,000 images of his botanical photos collected over the past 37 years, centered around Castellaia and related genera, and I hope he'll be giving us a link to that. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mark.
Hey everyone, let me go ahead and do screen sharing here. Let's see. And well, you've already heard the little introduction as to who I am, and I'm also, you could call myself an evangelist for Castellaia. I love sharing my experiences with these plants, and I've basically traveled all over North America and including much of Latin America and through the Andes in South America, searching for these plants. And some of the photos you'll see tonight are the result of that work. I've included a few species pictures from other folks, which are indicated on the individual slide. And those are for species that I haven't seen in the wild yet, but still hope to at some point. So anyway, this is a fairly long presentation, so I want to move fairly rapidly and get started. The focus is on the rare, endangered, and range limited species. And I've included in North America, not just the US and Canada, but also Mexico and Central America as well. So we'll go ahead and get started on that. The first thing that many people like to know about with Castellaia is how do you tell the different parts and where are the actual flowers and so on. When people first see these plants, they think, oh, these beautiful red flowers or yellow flowers or purple flowers, but in many species, not all, the primary coloration is actually on the floral bracts that behind which the actual flower, the calyx and corolla, are hidden at least partially. So this is an example from one of the species that I described, the very first one, Castellaia Chambersie, which is found in the Oregon Coast Range. And it's a pretty spectacular species. And so the basic anatomy is that most perennial Castellaias start out from a woody caudex that's below the ground, kind of like a woody root. And then these will often have smaller roots radiating out from them. There are some species that are rhizomatous, and there are also a whole complex of annual species that, of course, have annual roots and lack the woody caudex. Then there are the stems and leaves, which are usually similar to what you would find on other sorts of green plants. But in the inflorescence, the grouping of the flowers at the top of the plant, you have some of the characteristic structures of Castellaia and genera that are related to it, like Orthocarpus, Cordylanthus, and so on. So you have the usually brightly colored bracts, which are quite variable often in form, as you can see from the sample illustrations here. And then behind those bracts, you find the calyces, which are fused tubes, and the divisions of the calyces are different between different species and are often one of the characteristics that's used to describe or distinguish the species from each other. So focusing in on the calyx over here on the right side, you can see that you have a fused tube at the bottom, and then about halfway up usually, there's the clefting begins, and there are primary lobes, which are the adaxial and abaxial, if you use fancy botanical terms, or front and back cleft would be another way to do it. The front being the side facing the observer, and the back being the side that's facing the stem. And then there are lateral clefts, like you can see up here, that are often shorter than the primary lobes and primary clefts. But sometimes in some groups, they're about the same length, what we call, well, sub-equal is a term that you see in floras and keys to describe that. They're pretty close to being equal. But in a lot of species, the primary clefts are deeper than the lateral clefts. And then in some cases, the primary cleft will be deeper in the front than in the back. In other species, it's the reverse of that. And so there's a lot of diversity, but the general structure is the same in many or most of the species. Then you have, of course, the actual flower itself that's within the calyx and can be exerted or pushed out from the calyx to a huge degree in some species, to almost the same length as the calyx in others. Usually at least part of the corolla is sticking out of the calyx. Then within the corolla itself, you have the petals, 5 petals that are fused to form a basal tube. And then most species will have a somewhat reduced lower lip that's represented by 3 petals fused together. And you can see that in the 3 terminal teeth that are often apparent from the lower lip. And then the upper part, which in many flora is referred to as the galea, but in the Jepson and in my more recent work, I've accepted the Jepson's calling of this structure as the beak rather than the galea, because it is not closed at the end the way an actual galea is. Go back there. And then oftentimes the stigma will be exerted from the corolla tip. Other times it's included or not exerted from the corolla. And all of these can be characteristics that vary from one species to another and can be helpful in identifying one species from another. Some other details in the structure that's often useful that you see described in the Jepson manual is the seed coat type. And the seeds are usually pretty small, just half a millimeter to a meter in general. Some of them are even smaller than that. And they have a seed coat, which can have striations, as you see in this one, on the walls, or they can be smooth. And then this inner tangential wall that's sort of encloses or seals off the seed within. The seed coat can sometimes be transparent or opaque, sometimes ruptured when the seeds are mature, sometimes not. Those are other technical characters that are used sometimes to help sort out the many different species. By the way, there are about 200 species. We don't have a real accurate count because I know of several species out there that are undescribed, and there are probably many others that are waiting to be discovered as well, particularly in Latin America, but even here in the US and Canada as well. All right, so moving on. What we're looking at here is basically an evaluation of the patterns and distributions of Castellaia species. And there are definite classes that many of the species can be sorted into depending on how common and widespread they are. So first of all, you have many species which are quite abundant and widespread across large portions of the continent. For instance, sometimes spanning continents. Ones that are less widespread but are common within a certain region, like in California or the Pacific Northwest. Others that are geographically restricted but still pretty common locally, endemics to a particular mountain range and so on. Geographically restricted and habitat limited ones that are essentially not found in very many places, but have not a whole lot of threats to them, at least at this point in time. Then you have a more restricted group that are geologically restricted, but also are facing imminent threats from a variety of different sources. And then, unfortunately, we have a few species that have become extinct within historic times, or at least we think they're extinct. Fortunately, there aren't too many of those. And good news, toward the end of several species which were quite rare for a while, but due to the efforts of the Endangered Species Act and people who work to promote plant conservation, have been successful in recovering some of these species. So we'll be looking at examples of all of these throughout the presentation. So first of all, here's 4 examples of species that are abundant and widespread. C. coccinea is one that's found mostly in eastern North America, east of the Rockies. So it looks somewhat similar to California species like Aphinus, but not there. It's definitely in a different group. Across much of the Arctic, the Palearctic region, Russia in particular, Mongolia, other countries, there are a handful of Castellaias that have invaded that area from North America. And Castellaia pallida is one of those. It's quite common in places like the Yukon, Northwest Territories in Canada, and throughout much of Alaska, as well as being in the Palearctic or the Old World Arctic. Castellaia arvensis is one that's very widespread in Latin America, occupying almost the entire continent of South America and most of Central America and Mexico. Remarkably, it has never crossed into the US, except in Hawaii, where it's become introduced first near the Hilo airport, and then it kind of spread out from there to several of the other islands where it's become established. Although it's not an especially nasty weed, tends to occur in small areas, it still could technically be called a weed, one of the few such species in the genus. It's also invaded other islands like into the Caribbean and also into the Galapagos Islands as well. Then there's Archistelea Miniata, probably the most widespread species in Western North America, very well known to most people who botanize in Western North America. Tremendously diverse species in terms of form, color, and so on. They're not always red like this, but in any case, it is a very common species. Okay, then we have the regional species, which aren't really rare at all. They're quite common in the areas where they occur, but which are limited somewhat to a particular region. So for instance, we have Castellaia patriotica from the northern Sierra Madre in Mexico, which pops into southeast Arizona in the Chiricahua and Huachuca Mountains, but is quite widespread in the Mexican Sierras, of which the Chiricahuas are a part. Then Castellaia linearia loba, which is found in the west slopes of the Sierra Nevada and out into the Sacramento Valley, quite common in some areas around there, often confused with some of the species that occur farther west, but it is a pretty distinctive one once you get to learn how it's different from its close relatives like Castellaia attenuata and the pale forms of densiflora. Then moving on, we have C. scorzernerifolia, a hard one to pronounce, but a common species in parts of eastern and south central Mexico. And then Castellaia mexicana, which does occur in southwest Texas and places like Brewster County, sort of down towards the Big Bend area, but it's also fairly common in the dry grasslands and so on in northern Mexico. Okay, then we have species which are restricted in range, but are still can be abundant or common in particular areas. So one that's a pretty spectacular one that probably not many of you have seen pictures of before, Castellaia tapinoclada, is limited to the subalpine meadows in the mountains of western Guatemala. And it's only found in a few of the little mountain ranges that make up the western half of that country. It doesn't actually extend even into Mexico. But within that limited area, it's a very common species and fills the meadows sometimes with bright splashes of color. Very low growing, as you can see. Here in California, we have an endemic Castellaia Pearsonii, which is limited to subalpine in the east central Sierras. You don't find it up in the much north of, say, the Yosemite region, but it becomes quite a bit more common in the right habitats in the southern and central portions of the eastern Sierras. And another great example of one of the most exotic and beautiful Castellaias, Castellaia rowii, is common in along wet cliffs and so on in the central Sierra Madre Occidental, which is the main western mountain range that goes down through the left or western side of the Mexican portion of North America. It has these beautiful feathery leaves and these beautiful secund racemes that hang down on these dripping cliffs. It's really quite a spectacular species, but not that rare within its own limited range. All right, then we have species which are range restricted and habitat limited. So you could call them rare species or sensitive species, but aren't necessarily in immediate threat of extinction or don't face any real severe impacts from any sort of threat. So for instance, we have in the Bay Area, Castellaia affinis variety neglecta. I should mention, by the way, that those of you that use the Jepson manual are used to seeing that as subspecies neglecta and subspecies used for Castellaia. But both combinations exist, variety and subspecies. And for my work, I've decided to use only varieties because that involved fewer name changes for the flora of North America. And the editors in that volume had asked us to choose one or the other rather than using both forms unless there was some reason to do so. So I've switched over to calling them varieties, but for the most part, the names are the same. It's just the descriptor variety or subspecies that's different. So anyway, same thing. My conception of variety neglecta is the same as the concept of subspecies neglecta that are used by people who, primarily use the Jepson manual. Anyway, as most of you may know, this nice little form, a yellowish form of Castellaia affinis, which is more commonly red-orange, occurs on serpentine grasslands in the North San Francisco Bay Area, and both its habitat and its occurrence are pretty limited to a very specific habitat type, such as on Ring Mountain. So the area is protected, of course, so there aren't immediate threats to it, and that's why I would put a species like that into this category. Okay, another California one that is found farther north, mostly just in the coastal salt marshes around the Humboldt Bay and also up into Del Norte County, Castellaia ambigua variety Humboldtiensis. Unlike the other forms of Castellaia ambigua that are commonly known, the bract tips are purple here. Some folks have said that some of the plants that occur in the marshes around the Point Reyes area are also Humboldtiensis, even though they're not purple bracted. I kind of disagree with that, and I think that this variety is limited to the populations in the Humboldt and Del Norte County area, but that's just my opinion. Another form of the same species, Castellaia ambigua variety insalutata, is found in sandy coastal meadows, mostly in Monterey County. And it's particularly common around Monterey and Carmel itself, and on the Fort Ord property in some of the sandy meadows where it mixes a lot with Castellaia densiflora and Castellaia exerta. And it forms some really beautiful meadows if you get the chance to get onto the property there and see them in the spring. They often just form a really beautiful panorama of small annuals, which this is an annual species mixed in with the other great annuals like the leptosiphon in these gorgeous meadows. One that I described a few years back, Castellaia ambigua variety medii, is limited to very shallow vernal pools over basalt rock in the Napa County area. It's only found on a couple of private properties, so I think they try to organize at least one field trip a year to one of the populations up in the Napa County Land Trust. And I'm not sure how that works in terms of setting up an appointment to get on a list, but it is a pretty remarkable plant as well. Since we described it, Jake and I, a few years back, some molecular work that was done with this at the University of Idaho by Dave Tank and his associates has shown that this is actually more likely a full species, that it actually is genetically distinct from the other forms of Castellaia ambigua. I had decided to place it as a variety because of the fact that the flowers are very similar to a couple of the other varieties, although the leaves are quite different, being very thin and with narrow linear segments, as you can see there, filiform segments. So anyway, that may soon, within the next year or two, be elevated to species status by some other researchers. All right, another restricted species is Castellaia aquariensis, endemic to the Aquarius Plateau in southern Utah. It's quite common in some meadows, but it's threatened by grazing quite a bit. As you can see here, this is a place called Big Meadow Exclosure. And instead of fencing cattle out, what they've done is fence the plants into these little exclosures that exclude the cattle. And you can see what effect the cattle have here. This is a high elevation sage meadow at about 10,000 feet. And on the right of the fence where the cattle had access, there were virtually no plants. I think I found one or two poor looking stems in the area where the cattle were free to graze, whereas within the exclosure, the plants were quite common and blooming very nicely. So yeah, that's one of the typical threats to some of the high elevation species comes from excessive cattle grazing and other livestock. Here's one you may not have ever heard of. This is Castellaia Beldingi, which was for quite a while treated as a separate genus, Clevelandia, and which parenthetically is the name of a fish genus as well in the animal kingdom, but there's no rule against having the same genus name for plants and animals. In any case, the genus Clevelandia proved to be short-lived because DNA studies that were done about 15 years ago or so clearly showed that this particular species belonged in Castellaia, not in its own genus. And you can see the general structure is still there. You don't have the corolla shape so much as in the typical Castellaias, but you still have typical calyx structure here with the clefts and an upper lip and a lower lip. This is the lower lip here, but you don't have the upper lip fused into a tube nearly as much as in the more typical Castellaias. This is one of the species I've never seen. It generally blooms only after hurricane-type rainfall in the Cape region in southern Baja. And so you have to get there just at the right time in the right year in order to find these things in bloom. And John Rebman, who's the curator at the herbarium at the University of California in San Diego, got these excellent pictures a few years ago when there were some really good conditions. All right, Castellaia Chambersie, that referred to earlier. This is the species from which the line drawings were made. And you can see this one is limited to basaltic balds on the top of just 3 peaks, not very tall peaks, but they are the major peaks in the Coast Range in Clatsop County, Oregon, which is very close to the Columbia River. And then more recently, we discovered a small number of plants across the border in Washington on Weyerhaeuser Timber Company land in Pacific County, Washington. Needless to say, getting access in there is pretty difficult, but you can at least hike into these peaks in the Oregon Coast Range to see these very beautiful plants that grow usually in very wet areas on these basaltic openings near the top, sort of above the forest line or the tree line in the coniferous forests that flank these 3 peaks. As you can see, there are a few color variants, such as the yellow-orange one, that always make things kind of interesting in Castellaias. Okay, here's another very bizarre one from Mexico, Castelia Chloroceptron. This is found only in the understory of pine oak forests in the central Sierra Madre Occidental, so mostly in Sinaloa and Durango. And very bizarre plant, but if you look carefully, you see the same old Castellaia structures. Here's the bract, here's the calyx with the little side lobes, lateral lobes, and the primary lobes. And here's the corolla with this remarkable long, exerted, and coiled stigma that comes out from the corolla tip. Pretty remarkable plant. Another is in this category is Castellaia chlorotica, endemic to the montane pine forest understories and rocky areas in the south central mountains of Oregon. It is found close to the Cascades, but not really in the Cascades. It's more in the isolated mountain ranges in the desert regions of eastern Oregon, from the central part of the state to close to the California border, but it's never been recorded in California. This species is remarkable in that the bracts are all green. There's no bright colors in the inflorescence, except for the corolla itself, which has this remarkably curved corolla tube, or corolla beak, I should say. Pretty unusual one. This is related to the Castellaia applegatii that's common in California, but it lacks the reddish colors. But as you can see there, it's got wavy margined leaves and lots of glandular pubescence, little short hairs with tips on the glands, gland tips, mixed in with non-glandular hairs that are usually a little longer. All right, another California endemic is the wonderful Castellaia cinerea, found in the San Bernardino Mountains, to which it's entirely endemic. These are the usual ranges of color in this species. And looking over at this close-up, you can see these little dots that are up on the tips of the bracts mostly. And if you ever get a chance to look at those under a good dissecting scope or even a good pair of hand lens, you can see that they're a structure that's unique to any of the Castellaia species. It's a crystalline excrescence, kind of like a little tufa mound, if you will, like you see at Mono Lake, but built up on the surface of the bracts. And as I mentioned, I've not seen this type of structure on any other species of Castellaia. So this is really a pretty remarkable species, endemic to the pebble plains and some of the ridges in the higher parts of the San Bernardino Mountains. There is another form of this that occurs at somewhat higher elevations, what I like to call the vinicolor form, although it's not been formally described. It's regarded as just a distinctive form of Castellaia cinerea, although I keep wondering whether it really should be described as a variety. One of these days I'll get around to doing that, or at least seeing if the differences are consistent. But these are found mostly up on a high mountain ridge, Sugarloaf Mountain, if those of you that might be familiar with this range, and is found in juniper and cercocarpus woods on very stony, dry ground, as opposed to the pebble plains out typically around San Bernardino, or Big Bear Lake, I should say. That's where the yellowish and orangish ones tend to occur. But these ones up at the higher elevations and a few at lower elevations have this beautiful deep wine color in the bracts, and they're also tend much more commonly to have prostrate stems that just spread out over the ground, and just the tips or the inflorescence becoming sort of ascending or erect, not the whole stem. So pretty remarkable species. Now back into Mexico. This is another pretty cool looking Castellaia Conzatii, named after an early botanist in southern Mexico. And it's restricted to a certain type of forest, mixed montane forests in southern Oaxaca in the Sierra Madre del Sur. The white calyx tips are shared with another species that's found in that area that we'll see later. And then this white hairs or beard, as they call it, on the upper side of the corolla beak is pretty remarkable too, only found in a few other species. Back in my state on Mount Rainier, we have an endemic Castellaia, which is fairly common in the mountain meadows surrounding the mountain, especially on the north side of Mount Rainier. It's called Castellaia cryptantha, which means sort of shy or hidden. And it's found in turfy meadows that tend to at least be somewhat moist. And it's one of the few self-pollinated Castellaias. You'll notice you don't see any corollas coming out of the calyces here because the corolla is included. It very rarely, if ever, even pops the tip out of the calyx. And some studies were done in the 1940s where people put insect exclosures, cages basically, over the plants to see if the ones that were not accessible to insect pollinators would set seed without the pollinators. And what they found was that the ones that were excluded from pollinators had every bit as much seed set as the ones which were not in the enclosures. And so it was determined that these guys are self-pollinating, one of the few Castellaias that do have their reproduction in that sort of mode. Also, of course, not far south from where you guys are, there's the Castellaia densiflora variety obispoensis. Again, if you go to some of the coastal plain grasslands that haven't been developed in the area up towards San Simeon and so on from Morro Bay, these guys can be quite common out on the coastal plain. Of course, that area has also been subject to quite a bit of coastal development. And so that's certainly a plant that needs to be monitored and land protected to preserve it from further decreases in populations. But assuming those lands are protected, the species is actually fairly numerous in that area. All right, up in the bogs of the serpentine deposits in the Siskiyou Mountains is the pretty remarkable Castellaia Elata. It extends through the Siskiyou Mountain region into the southwestern portion of Oregon as well. And they interestingly exist in two different color forms, which don't occur in the same populations, at least none that I've seen. But they are very similar in other ways. Their floral measurements are almost identical. Little else besides the color that would separate them. So we're not really saying that should be varieties, but it is interesting that they do have these two distinct forms that occur in separate populations. The most frequent are the ones that have the beautiful pink-purple inflorescences, and these can grow quite tall, 4 to 5 feet or so, within the serpentine bogs, often mixed with other typical species like the Darlingtonias. And this, I should mention, this plant is treated as a subspecies of Castellaia Miniata in the Jepson manual, but I prefer to treat it as a separate species. I think it's deserving of that because it's separable from normal Miniata in several different ways, such as the corollas being shorter and the colors and so on. And of course, the ecology being strictly tied to these serpentine bogs. That's virtually the only place you find this particular species. Another one from Mexico, Gail Hintonier, named after the daughter of a famous botanist in Mexico. This one is similar, actually related to the common California plant, Foliolosa, and you can probably see the resemblance to Foliolosa, but there are a number of technical characters that this differs from that species on. And of course, it's completely separated from the range of Foliolosa, which is primarily California and northern Baja. And this plant is found only on limestone meadows in one region in a portion of Nuevo Leon, one of the northern states in Mexico. Back to California, Castellaia gleasonii, endemic to the San Gabriel Mountains in California, is probably a species of hybrid origin. It has branched hairs like Castellaia foliolosa, but it also has glandular hairs similar to, say, Castellaia martini, which is also found in that same range, the San Gabriel Mountains. But these plants are different from either of them and have evolved enough differences to be regarded as a separate species. It may be also closely related to Castellaia pruinosa, which is primarily a species of the Siskiyou region and then also in portions of the western Sierra Nevada. But the two don't really approach each other very closely, and they're separate in a number of technical characteristics. Castellaia Hidalgensis is named after an early botanist in the West, one of the early explorers, and is endemic to the rocky fell fields and slopes in the Rockies of southern Utah and northern New Mexico. You have to get to pretty high elevations to see it. It usually doesn't occur much under 10,000 feet and usually above that. And so unless you can find a good place to drive to, it's usually a healthy hike to get up into the habitat of this beautiful little plant. It's somewhat similar in color to the common rocky species Castellaia rexifolia that some of you may have seen. Very common purplish paintbrush in that region. But these ones, Hidalgensis, have divided leaves, or quite divided leaves, as opposed to the undivided leaves of rexifolia, and also the corollas are shorter, especially the corolla beak. Okay, here's a pretty gorgeous thing. This is a form of Castellaia Integrifolia the species itself, it occurs from northern South American Andes up into Tamaulipas in northeastern Mexico in scattered populations. But this particular variety with this remarkable, let's see, lost my place there. Oh, here we go. Sure why this is happening. Okay. Anyway, notice what they call the terminal bracts, the ones up near the top, almost look like rose petals. That's a really remarkable form and is something that's distinguishes this particular variety from the more common forms of Integrifolia. And it's another of the several endemic Castellaias that occur in the Sierra Madre del Sur of Oaxaca and nowhere else in the world. Okay, Castellaia Hiquilpana is found in montane meadows, open meadows in Michoacan. This is an area where there's been a lot of drug violence in recent years, unfortunately, as this is a really gorgeous part of Mexico, especially after the monsoon rains start. If you go there in late August, early September, it's just a gorgeous botanical region, but it's become pretty unsafe for people to go to. We went there about 15 years ago, I guess, and found this localized species. It is kind of unique in having a little whitish band on the bracts that separate the red at the top of the calyces, not the bracts, from the green basal portion. There's also some other technical distinctions for this one. Castelia Kybabensis, another rare endemic from the subalpine meadows of the Kaibab Plateau, as the name would imply. It's quite variable in color. This is the common range of colors. Occasionally you'll see ones that kind of look more like Miniata in color, sort of reddish, but primarily they're these softer shades of yellows and pale oranges and so on. Quite variable, and they can be quite common, but they only occur in a handful of meadows, mostly in the area as you approach the north rim of the Grand Canyon, near the border of the park, but some both inside the park and some outside the park. And they mostly occur in very flat, open meadows, as opposed to rocky slopes and so on. All right, one that we described just a few years back, named after my daughter, actually, Castellaia Cariana. This is endemic to limestone alpine habitats at high elevations in the area of the Scapegoat Plateau, which you may or may not have ever heard of, but it's a very isolated region in a large wilderness complex. The Bob Marshall Wilderness and the Scapegoat Wilderness designated federal wilderness areas are some of the most extensive wilderness land in the lower 48 states. And right in the middle of that wilderness region, about 20 miles from the nearest trailhead, is the habitat of this pretty remarkable species. That was first collected but a few times over the years, but was passed off as more common species, things like Castellaia rexifolia, or ones that don't even really look much like this one at all, that people had mislabeled them and just left them in herbaria. So anyway, through a long story, we figured out that this actually was a pretty unique plant, and I was able to join some of the Montana botanists who had been promoting it and did a horse pack trip way out into the wilderness to photograph the plants and make a type collection and so on. So a pretty amazing plant. Here's a second set of pictures that show other color variations that it comes in, as well as its high elevation limestone habitat. it shared that habitat with a lot of other great limestone species like Aquilegia jonesii. If you, any of you rock gardener folks may be familiar with that really remarkable plant that occurs not far from where Castellaia Cariana grows. Okay, another one that was recently described, well, in the last 20 years by some southeast botanists, Castellaia Crowleyana, is found only on dolomite glades in one county in central Alabama, Bibb County. And fortunately, almost all the occurrences are owned by the Nature Conservancy. So they are pretty well protected and are now studied and monitored. But they are pretty amazing occurrence. And this is another example of a species that was overlooked, even though the region had been heavily botanized for, a century and a half. These had escaped detection until fairly recent times. Another San Bernardino Mountains endemic is Lacio Renka, one of the annual Castellaias again. These are pretty remarkable, not only for being very localized endemic, only found in a few spots in the San Bernardino Mountains, but they have some other unique characteristics like tufts of hairs at the end of the calyx tips or bract tips when they're young. That's something that doesn't exist in other Castellaia species. And the corolla structure is pretty interesting as well. Okay, this is one that was described by Alice Eastwood a long time ago, 100 years ago, and was relegated for a long time to synonymy under Castellaia Lemoniae, which is found in the Sierra Nevada. This Lacinensis form we resurrected because it's pretty uniformly different from the Sierra Lemoniae, Castellaia Lemoniae, by the coloration of the corollas. They tend to be white with yellowish or greenish lower lips, whereas those structures would be mostly purple or pink purple in typical Lemoniae in the Sierra Nevada. They also grow on volcanic substrates, of course, growing on the sides of Mount Lassen. That's pretty much what they're limited to. Whereas, of course, the ones that occur in the Sierras are more on granitic substrates, like at Tuolumne Meadows. Up in the Northern California coast, and also just popping into Curry County in Southern Oregon, is Castellaia Mendocinensis, closely related to latifolia that's found in the Carmel and Monterey area. Castellaia Mendocinensis has a fairly long range close to the coast. It is very coastal, like latifolia is, but many of the areas where it occurs have been subject to coastal development. And so most of the populations that are still found are found in state parks and preserves, places where the coastal bluffs have not been destroyed for housing development or tourist attractions and things like that. So pretty remarkable plant as well. Castellaia Mogollionica is found in a place called the Mogollon Rim of East Central Arizona, and it extends into adjacent New Mexico. And another endemic from that region, Castellaia Organorum, which is limited to shady canyons in the Oregon Mountains. One of the more recent wilderness fights, trying to get the wilderness bills passed, established some wilderness areas in the Oregon Mountains which protect this species, which is really great. It's a pretty unique species. It's somewhat like the widespread Castellaia integra of the Southwest, but these plants are much taller and tend to be very branched, as you can see in the photo on the left, and can grow up 4 to 5 feet tall and just sort of drooped over other vegetation and so on, and only found in these little shady canyons. in the very steep slopes of the Organ Mountains. Okay, another one that used to be placed in a different genus, the genus Ophiocephala, is a species that's endemic to the Sierra San Pedro Martir, the first major mountain range south of the border in Baja. This is a really distinctive species, obviously. When you first see it, you might not even recognize it as being related to Castellaia, but the usual structures are still there, just modified in very unique ways, probably to adapt to its particular pollinators. We were able to see the pollinators come by these plants and notice how the anthers are exerted from the corollas and stick up into the air just by themselves. That you don't find that in most Castellaia species at all. And what we observed was that the bees that were in that area were basically trap lining, just going from one flower to the next and hovering or alighting on the stamens themselves, taking the pollen off of them and then hopping right over to the next inflorescence and, providing the cross-pollination in that way. So sticking the stamens out like they've done in this species is clearly just enticement to the local pollinators. But again, the genetic evidence proved that this Ophiocephala was actually well nested, as the geneticists like to say, within the DNA, overall DNA structure of the genus Castellaia. Okay, and another Mexican localized endemic Perelegans. This one was described by Francis Pinel many years ago on herbarium sheets as Castellaia Sanguinia, but he never published that name. I don't know whether he passed away before he had a chance to publish it, or whether he just decided it was not unique, but it clearly is, and it has several unique features, which I don't have time to enumerate. But it is definitely a very localized endemic in central Durango, mostly in the understory of coniferous forests, where it grows with this beautiful Pedicularis angustifolia that you can see in the yellow flowers there. Castellaia Puberulla is an endemic of the alpine, again, very high elevations. You almost never find it below 10,000 feet. Found in the alpine, usually kind of turfy grasslands. It grows on, probably the easiest place to see it is on the flanks of Mount Evans, where you can actually drive up the mountain, or at Guanella Pass, which is to the west of Mount Evans. It is a quite distinctive species, probably evolved from a widespread sagebrush relative, Castellaia flava, that grows at lower elevations. But this one is quite distinctive, related to flava, but definitely not part of that species. Yet another southwest endemic, Castellaia Rhizomata, which is found primarily only in Bryce Canyon National Park, although there have been, I think, one or two other populations discovered in the mountain range to the west of where Bryce Canyon is. And they only occur in a few of these very crazy, bright limestone barrens. Almost nothing else grows on this unique substrate, and it has an extremely high albedo, meaning that when you're out there, you pretty much have to wear sunglasses. The reflectance from the limestone is so bright and so intense that it makes your eyes squint. In any case, this is the only place, the only type of habitat where this particular Castellaia is found. Pretty remarkable, described by Noel Holmgren from collections in the 1970s that he made with Jim Revale, who is a great Eriogonum expert and Noel Holmgren's collecting buddy and lifelong friend. Unfortunately, Jim passed away a couple of years ago, which some of you are probably aware, which was too young. He was only in his 60s, I believe. And he was a prodigious botanist and one of the all-time greats of North American botany. So it's nice that we have that Castellaia named after him. Castellaia Rhizomata, another unique one from the Sierra Madre in Mexico. This one from Southwest Chihuahua. And it's remarkable in that it forms these rhizomatose clumps. Some of them can be 5 or 6 feet across, just a mass of rhizomes that have these beautiful inflorescences rising above them. It's another couple shots. Notice how small and compact the foliage is compared to the inflorescence. And another that's found more in wet meadows near El Salto Durango in the central Sierra Madre Occidental. It's completely limited to these seasonally flooding meadows. I've been in that same spot where these pictures were taken in April during the dry season there, and it looked like basically a vacant lot with trash blowing around and almost nothing but what looked like weeds in the place. But if you go there in early September, when this was taken after the monsoon rains come to that region, the place becomes a little flooded meadow. And this whole community of music-liking plants pops up and flowers and sets seed within the monsoon season. So again, pretty remarkable situation. And this particular species only found in that habitat in that one limited part of one mountain range in Mexico. There's some more views of it. Similarly, Castellaia schizoptrica is found up in the dry subalpine limestone meadows in the Siskiyou region, mostly in the Marble Mountains and along the Siskiyou Ridge part of Southern Oregon, and pretty much just limited to that region and that one type of habitat. Beautiful color. These are one of my top 10 favorite Castellaias for sure. Photographing them is a little bit of a challenge because the branched hairs that cover the bracts and leaves tend to make it look kind of fuzzy. So even though you have pretty good focus, the plant looks slightly out of focus anyway. So, but they are gorgeous, and again, one of my favorites. Here's some more photos of it. Okay, one of the final groups are geographically restricted habitat limited facing significant threats. So these are ones that you could say should be on the threatened or endangered list, even if they're not. One of these that's not a listed plant at this time, except possibly on international plant lists, is Castellaia Bella, found only on 2 or 3 peaks in the highest parts of the Sierra Madre Occidental, or should be Oriental. That's actually a typo that I need to correct. The eastern mountain range in Mexico, in the state of Nuevo Leon. It's a true alpine plant and grows with a really remarkable community of endemic plants up on the top of this particular mountain, which there is a road going up it, fortunately for us, to some transmission towers found on the summit ridge. And again, these are the only place, 1,000, just down into the tree line, just 100 feet or so below the summit, these totally disappear. They're only out in the open top. You can see they're quite remarkable and beautiful plants. Okay, another one that's remarkably rare and increasingly rare is Castellaia campestris variety succulenta. The common variety is much more widespread and common and is abundant in some vernal pool areas. But variety succulenta is much more geographically restricted, mostly in the central San Joaquin, and is increasingly threatened by agriculture and development in those regions. In fact, the area where I took these pictures is completely devastated now and doesn't support any of the plants. They've been extirpated from this particular spot. Here's the most recent addition to Castellaia, actually, that we published just earlier in this year, 2021. For a long time, I had been puzzled by reports of Castellaia ambigua, the common salt marsh plant of central and northern California and extending up the coast all the way to Vancouver Island. But the plants that I'd seen poor pictures of, or fuzzy pictures of herbarium specimens and so on, really didn't look like Castellaia ambigua to me. They looked like some sort of weird form of Castellaia exerta, or possibly densiflora, or perhaps hybrids. I wasn't really sure what to make of them. And so I figured they were just, odd plants for one reason or another. But last year, during the early parts of the COVID lockdown, I noticed on iNaturalist that Paul Escoffier, who is a graduate student at the university there in San Luis Obispo, had posted these pictures that he had taken out on the coastal bluffs northwest of the town of San Luis Obispo. And I said, wow, that's something I've never seen before. This is really different. And then I noticed that some other folks had also posted pictures, such as Morgan Stickrod and a few other California botanists. And about the same time, I realized that on the Jepson website, or the CCH2 website, they had posted better pictures of some of the specimens that had been collected 20 or 30 years ago of these plants, but had been just dismissed as Castellaia ambigua, the typical form. But as you can see here, they really are different. The bracts are white-tipped, like you would see in normal Castellaia ambigua, but the corolla is quite different, having the pretty strongly pink-purple lower lip on the corolla, the three lobes, and also the galea, or beak, also being purple. And so we describe this as a variety of ambigua because the general corolla form is similar to the plants you find in salt marshes and coastal bluffs farther north. But the habitat here is a little bit different, and the coloration of the corollas is unique and also completely uniform. All of the plants in this region in northwestern San Luis Obispo County look like this, and none of the plants in that area look like the ones farther north. Likewise, farther north, you never see plants that look like this. Some of the insolutata plants can look like these when they age, but not when the corollas are fresh, like you see here. So we named it in honor of Larry Heckard, who of course was one of the prime movers behind the revision of the Jepson Flora, the new edition that was published in the 80s, and then the more recent, or 90s rather, and then the more recent Jepson 2. In any case, you won't find this in that volume because it was, as I mentioned, just described this year. The plants are difficult to access and are threatened by not only development, but also by weeds and being overtopped and overgrown by invasive grasses at one of the sites near Piedras Blancas. And then the other populations occur on the Hearst property, and access to that property has become very difficult. In cattle are grazed there, and which actually could benefit the plants in terms of keeping the grasses under control if it's monitored at the proper levels. But the existence or the continued existence of these small populations is definitely problematic, and unless people pay a little more attention to them than they have in the past, which hopefully will happen. All right, another very localized one is found, Castellaia Chrystiae, named after a botanist in the Pacific Northwest. And it's endemic to the summit meadows on Mount Harrison, an isolated peak in Cassia County, Idaho. And it's literally only occurs in the alpine and upper subalpine on this one mountain peak. And yet it's quite distinctive. Likewise, another that we described just in the last decade, Castellaia Coligiorum, it was actually brought to my attention by a Forest Service botanist who said, oh, this is weird. This doesn't really look like anything I've seen around this region. And so she sent it to some botanists who sent it to other botanists, and they eventually, the photos made it to me. And I said, wow, I've never seen this before. And so the next year I went with my co-author of the species out to this one meadow complex, Big Meadow it's called. And it is a fairly large meadow, but this is the only place in the world where this species is found. And it's quite unique. It's somewhat like Castellaia cryptantha that grows around Mount Rainier in the coloration, but the corolla is differently structured, and that I don't think it really is actually that closely related to the Castellaia cryptantha. Another localized endemic, Castellaia cryptandra, which is only found around the Colima volcanoes. This is a series of 2 or 3 active to dormant volcanic peaks in the state of Colima. Every so often, every few years, you hear about a volcanic eruption from these. It's one of the peaks is, quite active and is often still smoking and sends out lava and explosive volcanic activity every few years or so. We photographed these on the slopes of the more dormant volcano that has allowed the development of this pretty unique species. It's quite beautiful too. And it occurs only around timberline in grasslands on the edges of this volcanic cone. It's pretty amazing. One which I have not found yet, which I've made 2 trips to look for, one to Guatemala and one to Oaxaca. I was successful neither time in finding this one. But it has 2 forms. The Mexican species is variety Tenodonta, and the other is Altorum, which is found in the highlands in the Sierra de Cuchumatanes in one province in Guatemala. They're pretty remarkable in the leaves and bracts, having those filiform pinnate lobes. And as I mentioned, this is one I'd really like to see in life, but it must be quite rare because we went to places where there were historical collections, and at the right time of year, but we were totally stumped in terms of finding actual living plants. I should mention just briefly, before I leave that one, notice this specimen on the left. This was collected by Cyrus Guernsey Pringle, who's one of my botanical heroes in the early 1900s. And he was especially adept at pressing plants and preserving the colors. It's just amazing to me that this middle specimen here has all the colors preserved, even after having sat on an herbarium shelf for many, many decades before I took that photograph of it. You can see this specimen here is not as well preserved, collected by a different collector, actually several decades after the Pringle collections. And it was treated evidently with mercuric chloride, which causes the staining that you see on the herbarium sheet So those herbarium sheets need to be handled with care because sometimes you can actually absorb some mercury dust from the old sheets. All right, Castellaia Fraterna is endemic to just a few peaks in the northeastern portion of the Wallowa Mountains in northeastern Oregon. It's one of my favorites. I just love this little species for some reason. It's strictly alpine again. You never find it even that close to timberline. And it often grows with another endemic of that region, the little yellowish form that you can see in the middle right picture, Castellaia Chrysantha. Another one I have not seen, endemic to Mexico in Chiapas, Castellaia filiflora, a rhizomatose species, as you can see. It may actually be wiped out now. Some of the botanists, Mexican botanists that live in that area, have tried to find it, and they've been unsuccessful in recent years. But the California botanist, Dennis Breedlove, who some of you may have heard of, actually was one that collected the type specimen and several of the other specimens of this particular form. So it's quite distinctive too. So hopefully it's not extinct and just haven't found the right places. I was hoping to look for it when I visited that region in 2017, but we weren't able to get far enough into Mexico from Guatemala in order to get to the habitat, so we had to give up. Okay, Castellaia fructicosa. This grows only on Isla Guadalupe, which many of you probably know is a large island south of Catalina and San Clemente in Mexican waters, and has actually two species of endemic Castellaias. This one, which is still extant, fruticosa, just somewhat similar to foliolosa that grows in California. But as you can see, the growth form is very different. It was almost wiped out by the goats that were brought to this island. But a few managed to survive around the field station they have. And since the goats have been removed, the plants have started to spread and become more common, as is usually the case. Okay, another recently described one, Halophila. This also has quite a story to it. It's found only on one shell island, sort of a barrier island structure around Port Aransas, Texas. It actually spans several counties where these counties come together, but its actual geographic range is incredibly limited, and it occurs virtually at sea level. As you can see here, that's water coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. And you can imagine what happens there. For instance, just a few years ago when a major hurricane hit that area, bullseye right on this very spot, basically. And yet botanists went out the next year and there they were, still growing, even after having been scoured by a hurricane crossing right over the middle of that area. They're very similar to the common Texas paintbrush, which has reddish bracts usually, and reddish calyx tips like you see here. This one is almost always white. Some of the plants have a slight pinkish tint, but you never see the red plants here. They also tend to be taller than the Castellaia indivisa and less and more often have just a single stem rather than a clump of stems coming up from a single root base. Okay, Castellaia Hidalgensis, another fairly recently described endemic this time to the state of Hidalgo, growing only on limestone substrates. You see you recognize this is a common trait in many of the rare Castellaias. They occur on excuse me, one particular substrate, in this case, limestone. And here's a couple pictures from our group from the Washington Native Plant Society that came along with me on this trip to make a type collection and photograph the plants and so on. And you can see just how tiny the plants are. Here's one right here. And here's a little cluster right here next to Linda's knee. Castellaia Holmgreni is one that I was able to name after a person I regard as one of my Castellaia mentors, Noel Holmgren, now retired from the New York Botanical Garden, but he was very supportive of my early work in Castellaia. And so I was able to name this unique plant from Durango and Sinaloa in Mexico. One of the unique things about it, besides the rounded bracts, are almost the entire plant is covered with glandular hairs. It's almost 100% coverage. It's really quite remarkable in that respect. All right, down in Costa Rica, we have Castellaia Lentiai. This has only been collected 4 or 5 times. I looked at it, or looked for it, when I was in Mexico, in Costa Rica, and even went there with the guy that it was named for, Roy Lent, who is now passed on. But he took me to one of the populations he had found, but we were unable to locate plants. Not sure why, but we looked and couldn't find any. Again, it has those kind of unusual leaves like Castellaia tenodonta, you might remember a few slides back, but not particularly closely related to that plant. And another one, 3 other endemics in Mexico, which I have not seen because I've never been to the Sierra de Manantlan, which is the home to all 3 of these. It's fairly hard to get into that area, and it's well known as a narco cultivation area, so not a particularly safe place to visit either, although I'm still hoping to get up there at some point because the University of Guadalajara does have a research facility up there where people do go to, so maybe one of these days. In any case, these are photographs by Hugh Iltis, who wrote the flora for the Sierra de Manantlan, and he photographed these plants, all of which have been described in the last 50 years or so. Okay, out on the California Channel Islands, the North Channel Islands, we have one of the most remarkable endemics in California, Castellaia Mallis. Perhaps you've seen these if you're lucky enough to get to either Santa Rosa or San Miguel. San Miguel, it's now been extirpated from. We made a pretty thorough search for it a few years back and could not find any plants near where it had been collected on San Miguel. So it now appears to be entirely limited to Santa Rosa Island, and where it grows on the coastal terrace, mostly on the northern part of the island. I'm sorry, on the eastern part, the part that faces the mainland of California. It's a spectacularly beautiful place to walk and survey for these plants. There were peregrine falcons nesting on the cliffs and all kinds of just wonderful plants growing there in addition to the Castellaia Mallis. Also found these rather unusual color forms of it, pretty striking plants for sure. Most of them look more like the ones in the first picture, just sort of a plain yellow, but there were a few that were kind of this red, golden, orangey color that hard to describe. Okay, another one of my very favorites and most unique Castellaias is Castellaia Nitricola, which is found only in wet alkaline meadows in a very small portion of San Luis Potosi, one of the eastern provinces of Mexico, or eastern states. Not really closely related to anything else and quite unique, especially in this the petaloid lower lip to the corolla, like you can see here and here. And the coloration is pretty unusual too. Another Oaxaca endemic, Castellaia nivibractea, only found on the upper slopes of Cerro Quixobra, which is a endemic name from the native peoples that live in that region. It's a beautiful thing too, is that bracts start out white and then age pinkish, which gives the plants these two-toned, really striking appearance. Just a few more. And Castellaia Ornata. This one is in critical danger. It may be extinct in Mexico. We're not really sure. There may be some populations hidden somewhere that have survived the onslaught of both the drought in that region and the extensive cattle grazing and conversion to agriculture in the grasslands, native grasslands where it grows. But it was discovered not too long ago in the 1990s in the Animas Valley in Hidalgo County, Mexico, which is in the very southwestern portion of New Mexico, which feels a lot like being in northern Chihuahua, in the Chihuahuan grasslands. And the habitat there has been preserved from at least very extensive grazing. And so some of the native flora still exists there. When I visited the area and took these pictures, there were several thousand plants that I saw. It was actually not that uncommon. But local surveys have shown that the recent droughts and climate activities in that area seem to be making the plants be greatly reduced in numbers, even when there is good monsoon rain now. We're hoping that there is still some seed bank there and these plants may recover once, assuming that the persistent droughts end there. But this is a plant that may well be headed for extinction unless climate change and so on can be brought under control, which seems increasingly unlikely, at least in the time frame that would save these plants, but can hope for the best. Here's the habitat where they grow. The foreground is in New Mexico. The hills in the far end are in the San Luis mountain range, which is actually in Chihuahua. The border fence is somewhere in between there. I'm unsure whether the border wall was actually constructed through this area. I'm hoping it wasn't, but they did come very close when they blasted out the mountains to the west of, just a few miles to the west of here. One of the great ecological travesties of the wall construction was what they did to the mountain range there, just destroying huge amounts of habitat for essentially no reason at all. Just to try to get as much of the wall finished before they were forced to stop. So I won't say any more about the politics of that, but you can see where my feelings lie. Okay, Castellaia, two that are endemic to northeastern Mexico, which I've never seen. The one on the left, Porphyroceptron, is known only from the type specimen and two photographs that you see there from that. I tried to find it one time, but we didn't have enough time to really get to the elevation where it occurs, and I haven't made it back there since to look for it. And then one from a small mountain range not too far from the US border, Castellaia Papillonis. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. I have to practice that one. In any case, that one's known only from a handful of collections from this one limited range as well. One we did finally get some good pictures of is this one, Castellaia racemosa. Used to be, again, placed in a different genus, Gentria, after the famous botanist named Gentry. It's endemic to one particular part of the Sierra Madre in western Mexico, the Sierra Surutato. This area is also famous not only for this Castellaia, but for being the home country for the Sinaloa cartel and El Chapo. I have no idea where his actual residence was, but it was in this range, and it has long been regarded as a dangerous place to visit. I did make a trip there with a local tour guide in 2002, but we were only able to spend a very limited time up in the habitat, and were questioned by several groups of kind of scary looking people as to what we were doing. And fortunately, my guide was fluent in Spanish and had contacts in the local Mexican military, so he was able to convince them to just let us look at plants for a little bit and take off. But anyway, also through iNaturalist, I made contact with a Mexican botanist who lived in that area and traveled there fairly regularly. And so I interested him in going up and looking for them in a different part of the range where it had also been collected, and he was successful in finding them, and finding quite a few of them. So these are literally the first photographs that have been taken by anyone that I know of this pretty remarkable species. One of these days I hope to get back up there, but we'll see. Castellaia rubita. This is another endemic to the Wallowa Mountains, only found on the limestone substrates in the alpine of just a handful of peaks. This one was photographed on the upper flanks of Matterhorn Peak, one of the main high country peaks of the Wallowa Mountains. Another one that's somewhat related to Castellaia rubita is Salsuginosa, which is found only around the Monte Neva hot springs in White Pine County, and possibly around some other hot springs in that region. Very specific habitat type, and this is one from another hot springs area. As you can see, it's slightly different, kind of more compact inflorescence. We don't really know whether it's just, local variation from hot spring to hot spring, or whether these represent, different forms of the same species that could be called varieties. More research is needed, I suppose. Castellaia tomentosa is one that was described by Asa Gray way back in the early days of botanical exploration in the Southwest. But then he decided that it really wasn't that different from Castellaia integra. But I decided, when I studied the type specimens and found these plants in the life, real live plants down in the same Animas Valley area in southwestern New Mexico, that these really didn't seem like Castellaia integra or any of the other species that grow in that region. It has several traits that are distinct from them, and they correspond exactly to the traits in the typed collection that you can see in the middle there from the Harvard Herbarium. So we revived Castellaia tomentosa, and since that time, in the last couple of years, botanists in that region have also discovered some new populations in Sonora, just across the border in Mexico. Okay, here's somewhat of a treat. You guys are among the few people to see the first pictures of an undescribed species. Yet another of the benefits of iNaturalist. I found this on iNaturalist, posted by people who just had it listed as Castellaia species, but it's definitely very distinct and unlike anything I've seen in my research, and is only at this point known from a small curved mountain range, curved in geography, in Nuevo Leon, in the very northernmost tip of the Sierra Madre Oriental. It's unique in multiple ways. First of all, these strange, widely divaricately branched bracts, many of which have secondary branching on them. The extremely long calyx, which you can see here, that's just crazy long for most Castellaia species. And then the corolla, which can be exerted or partially exerted from that very long calyx. And also the habitat is pretty interesting too. So I'm working with two Mexican botanists, the two folks that took these photographs, and also did some very good work in terms of looking for new populations of it and so on. I'm hoping to get some specimens from them so that we can, make the technical description and formally publish it within the next year or so, but we'll see. We do have a name for it, but since I don't want to mess up the publication technicalities, we're not, publishing the name here on Zoom or YouTube or anywhere else for the moment. Here's a couple other pictures of it. As you can see, it's also pretty unique in that it's highly rhizomatose. There are only a few other Castellaia species that are this rhizomatose and forming clumps that pass among the leaf litter and the bryophyte displays and so on. One other Mexican endemic, which I have not yet seen, high on my list, is Venusta. It's known only from one peak in Guerrero. This is another area which is regarded as pretty dangerous to visit, which is why I haven't gone there. Even Mexican botanists are pretty hesitant to go there, except under very controlled conditions because of drug cultivation and also other types of armed groups that tend to hang out in that area. So pretty hazardous, but it is a super unique plant, and I would love to see a picture of it in life. As far as I know, no one has ever photographed it in life. I've certainly never seen a picture of it. Castellaia Victoriae is found near Victoria, BC. It's named partly for the town and partly for a friend of mine who met a tragic death, who was named Victoria. So it occurs only on the immediate coast, and as you can see, they're very close to sea level. And in fact, most of the populations are within the spray zone at high tide on very thin soil over volcanic rock. Almost all the plants are now found only on a place called Trial Island, which is off the main coast of Vancouver Island, very close to the city of Victoria. It's also known from a small island of only about an acre or two called Iceberg Island in the San Juans of Washington, and only in the US on that one tiny piece of rock. There's a population of a few hundred plants there usually in most springs, and quite a unique little plant. It was passed off as either Castellaia ambigua or Castellaia tenuis for many years, but it's definitely unique from either of those species and extremely unique in habitat as well. A few more pictures of this great little plant. Okay, the Castellaia with the longest name, Castellaia Zempowalta petalensis, found only on Summit Ridge, over 10,000 feet of Serra Zempowatapetl, which is found in the Sierra de Juarez region of central Oaxaca. Really a gorgeous plant. I'm sure I'm already over time, or I'd tell you the stories about what we found up there on the top of the mountain. Very interesting experience, to say the least, but that will have to wait for another time. How's that for a tease? In any case, there's another picture of the habitat. Okay, now getting toward the end. These are plants which are likely extinct in the wild. Guadalupensis was an endemic on Isla Guadalupe, the second endemic Castellaia there, but evidently the goats, the feral goats, wiped it out before they were removed from the island. It may exist on some of the high cliffs way out on the edges of the island where the animals couldn't get to, but nobody has found any remnants of it since then. But it is possible that it could be hanging out there and just waiting to expand its range back into a place where people can actually get to it. I've always thought a drone botanist should go out there to Guadalupe and cruise the cliffs and look for colonies of this plant. It probably is easily seen if they are there. So anyway, Castellaia uliginosa used to grow in the Pitkin Marsh of Sonoma County, but has been wiped out. This is a picture from the botany greenhouse where the clones are still in existence at Berkeley. I was fortunate to go out there with Larry Heckard and saw the last existing plant before it died off in the wild. The one time that I actually met Larry Heckard in life is the day we went out to look for that plant. Unfortunately, it was so depleted by that time that it wasn't in flower, but I do have a picture of the last wild plant, not in this show, but this is from the greenhouse. It's very similar to Castellaia Miniata, but it is distinctive in the color and also its low elevation habitat, far from where Miniata typically grows in California, mostly in the Sierras and in the southern mountains. Castellaia ludoviciana is very similar and maybe conspecific with Coccinia, another species in the southeast. But there are some differences, and I'm not completely convinced it was actually not a unique species, but we'll never know because it appears to be extinct. I spent several days looking for it in Jeff Davis Parish, Louisiana. Not many other reasons to go to that particular spot, but I could not find it, even though there were a few little remnants of the native grasslands that used to exist there. Virtually all of it is converted to farmland. Leschkiana used to be out on Point Reyes. It was known from the type collection and then from this photograph of a plant that was collected on the peninsula and then photographed at a flower show in that area that was held in May 1960. So we don't know exactly where the location was where it was collected in 1960. But this is still the only photograph we have of a live plant. And it corresponds very nicely in characteristics to the characteristics of the types collection itself. And to my mind anyway, is exactly, obviously the same species. So in any case, it may also exist somewhere out on the wilds of Point Reyes, probably in the shrubby dunes out there near the radio towers or somewhere like that. Who knows? Lots of people have looked unsuccessfully since then, but it may still be there. Okay, finally, some success stories, 3 species that were literally close to extinction, but are now recovering nicely due to removal of predator species, hooved predators in particular. And so Castellaia Grisia, one of the first species listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act and endemic to San Clemente Island. Of course, that island is completely owned by the Navy, and they've been nice enough to set aside the main habitat areas for this species and facilitated the removal of the feral goats that were literally drove this very, very close to the point of extinction. There were only a handful of known plants at the time they started removing the goats. The Fund for Animals and Animal Rights Group fought them in court for years, but eventually they lost, the animal rights groups lost, trying to protect feral goats over this whole complex of beautiful and amazing rare plants and rare animals as well that the goats were endangering. But finally, the goats were effectively removed, shipped off the island, and the last few killed, as should have happened much earlier. But that's the way things go. In any case, the Castellaia has made a very nice recovery. It's a large shrubby species, and down near Pyramid Head at the south end of the island, it's abundant. I was fortunate enough to visit that area. The Navy actually flew me out there, amazingly enough, as a Castellaia researcher. And I stayed with the other researchers at the field station they have there and went out looking for it in a couple of different spots. And these large shrubs of the species were actually becoming fairly common, at least in limited areas on the island. Another island endemic, Castellaia Hololuca, that's made a nice recovery related to Foliolosa of the mainland, but definitely different from that species. For a while in the first Jepson manual, it was lumped with the southwestern species, Castellaia Lanata. But in my opinion, and in the opinion of most other botanists, these are quite distinct from Lanata, which doesn't form large shrubs like this and differs in other ways. In any case, this is best thought of as a northern Channel Island endemic. It's now found on Anacapa, Santa Rosa, San Miguel, Santa Cruz. I believe those are the 4 islands where it occurs. And at least on San Miguel, it's become one of the most common plants there. Well, super characteristic of the San Miguel flora at this point in time. It comes in different color forms. This is the yellow form, which is most common on Santa Rosa and San Miguel. But on Santa Cruz, you get both colors. This one and the red form that you see here, this was taken on Santa Cruz. And then it also occurs, the reddish form, on Anacapa, where the yellow form is not found. And finally, another success story is Castellaia levisecta, a species that was extirpated from Oregon in the Willamette Valley area from housing and agricultural development, but persisted in a few small populations in the Puget Trough of Washington state. And from there, Tom Kay and other folks that work in plant conservation in Oregon decided to try cultivating it and outplanting it into some of the national wildlife refuges in the Willamette Valley, such as the fairly well-known Finley National Wildlife Refuge near Corvallis. And since those areas are protected, they made a perfect outplanting place for levisecta, which has now become reestablished in Oregon. And there are now tens of thousands of plants there growing in the Willamette Valley. Whether they continue in that abundance, under natural conditions remains to be seen, but at least for now, the outlook for this species is vastly improved over what it was just 20 years ago. So another great story and a wonderful, unique paintbrush species that we call the golden paintbrush, one of the prizes of the Northwestern flora. So that concludes my slideshow. And I don't know if there's anybody still out there in the audience, but I can talk about Castellaia for hours and hours. So I'm willing to answer any questions that might be out there.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark. That was a remarkable journey through all your deep knowledge and field experience, seeing all these species. And I was just wondering how many, so there are about 200 species, you said, altogether in the genus?
Yes.
And you've probably seen, except for the ones you mentioned that were likely extinct or impossible to get to in Mexico, you've probably seen quite a few, right, at this point?
I've seen all of the ones in the US and Canada, and about 90% of those in Mexico, and about maybe half the species in South America. I've still never been to Siberia, though. So I'm waiting to take the Trans-Siberian Railroad and go looking for those ones.
Well, we have to have you back and do all the common species next, so we can work on that. We have a few questions. So regardless if the people are still here, they will be on YouTube, and I think this is going to be a great record of your work. So so some of these habitat restricted species, you talked about some, and very, limestone balds and things. Could they be at risk of extinction from large fires that are going on in some of these places?
Well, possibly. That the fire might tend to jump past them to stay in the timber. And as long as the underground parts and the seeds aren't affected, I would expect they would come back in most cases. I'd have to think through all of the different individual situations and individual species to say for sure. But I would say in general, probably not a huge threat to them.
That's good. Always a lot of us is that these are hemiparasitic, correct? So
Yes.
There's also, you must have a lot of knowledge of the host plants for these, and how big of a range. Someone asked the question of how big of a role do you think the host range plays for these hemiparasites? And well, that's a different question, but any comments about the host plants for these?
Sure. Yeah, this is a commonly asked question. And first of all, they are hemiparasites, so they don't have to be attached to the roots of another plant to survive and set seed. Larry Hecker did greenhouse studies back in the 1960s that showed that all but one of the, I think, 20 species he grew in the greenhouse did better with a host. He was using Helianthus annuus as the host plant in all of these. And there was one species, I don't remember which one it was, maybe Castellaia latifolia, didn't show any increased seed set when it was grown with the host, but all of the others did show. They flowered more vigorously and set more seeds, but none of them was obligate to having a host. They were still able to reproduce successfully. Now, very few, if any, of the species are host specific, meaning that, true parasites like Orobanche often tend to be associated with one particular species, such as ivy. That's one that comes to mind. Castellaias are not like that. There are a couple of exceptions where, for instance, Castellaia rigida, which grows in Texas and down into northern Mexico, is almost always found with agave lechugia and growing, right up close next to the plants or not more than a few feet from them. And I've never seen Castellaia rigida without lechugia with it. So yeah, that's a pretty tight one. Many other species have favorite hosts. For instance, ones like chromosa and linearifolia that are well known in California are usually, most of the time, found with sagebrush, but you also find them not with sagebrush. Right. So they're obviously not obligate hosts.
So what's pollinators? So are some of these to have specific pollinators, or what's a typical pollinator for different Castellaias?
Well, they've often been known as hummingbird plants, and many of the species definitely are. Pretty much limited to the ones that have the long tubular corollas and brightly colored reddish particular bracts and calyces. So those are the ones that tend to attract hummingbirds, but the majority of species actually are bee pollinated, much more so than hummingbirds, and even some of the hummingbird pollinated ones can also be pollinated by bees. And they're one of the things to know about Castellaia is that when they say, well, this is a red bracted species or this is a yellow bracted, they almost all have variants of other colors, and sometimes lots of other variants of other colors. And so in some areas where both bees and hummingbirds are found in abundance, that may account for why there are such variations in the color, that the plants are splitting the difference between the two pollinators. Of course, that's conjectural. I don't think anybody's actually formally studied that.
Always more topics for study for graduate students. So that
Further
actually
study
leads into
needed.
another question: if the soil type determines the color of the bracts?
Nothing that I've seen conclusive on that. Again, perhaps, but I wouldn't even know of an example that could be used to test that. They tend to be more, the species is limited to a particular substrate, but they can be multicolored within that substrate. So
Sure.
My thought is that it's more pollinator driven than substrate driven, but who knows?
Here's a question I'm going to do my best. Is the Castellaia cryptantha cleistogamous? Or maybe you could define what that is too for some of us.
Yeah, meaning forming seeds without being opened. Well, the plants are open and they would be available to a pollinator, and they may actually be pollinated by insects at times, but they can set seed without pollinators. So in that sense, you could classify them in that way. But
that particular species, the cryptantha.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it in the same way that you would use that term, say, in Mimulus. I wouldn't use it to relate to Castellaia.
Okay. Are members of the Orobanchaceae particularly difficult to preserve the colors in herbarium collections? Are there any special techniques can be used to press them?
Well, a good question, because many of them do lose their color. But Pringle, for instance, was great at preserving them. I've been fairly successful in my drying technique, which is not very advanced or special. I just, when I get home from a plant trip, I put my plant press in my car and let it bake in the sun for a few days. And that's it.
Yeah, and we have photography now, so that helps as well, but it's always good to have the original specimen.
Most of my plants do come out with their colors preserved. So I guess the better question is, what are the other guys doing to mess it up? Maybe they leave them in the presses too long or something.
I'm glad there are some records of some of these plants that may be extinct, though. I mean, it just shows the importance of voucher specimens in herbaria.
Absolutely, yeah.
A couple more, if you have time.
Sure.
Castellaia has so many limited habitat species. Is the amount of speciation typical or higher than many other plants?
Well, they're using the old scroffs as an example. There are other genera which follow that same sort of pattern. For instance, penstemon, you have many widespread species, but you also have tons of species that are very limited in distribution, very limited to particular substrates and particular habitat types. And the Framaceae with Erythranthe and Mimulus and Diplocus, those ones are similar as well. So that's definitely a trend in many larger plant groups, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely makes it fun. And Mexico, I was really struck, and someone else was as well, at how much diversity in Mexico. I didn't quite realize that. And is that the hot spot of speciation, would you say, or is it more California?
Two. One is California and one is Mexico, particularly Western Mexico. The mountain ranges on the western side of the country are much more diverse, as is the case in North America. And, there's Oregon, for instance, has 45 species. I know because I just got finished with writing the revision for the flora there. So there's quite a number there as well. But California has more, and it definitely decreases both eastward and northward from Oregon, certainly.
Well, it was eye-opening for me to realize that. And some of those Mexican species don't really look what I think of as Castellaia, like a paintbrush or an owl's clover at all. They were so tropical looking to me.
Yeah.
And this is the last question. I'm not certain I understand it, but how large of a role do you think host range plays for these hemiparasites in their geographic distribution? So,
host range of the host.
Oh, I see.
range of the host
the
plant.
host plant. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Okay. You know, for some of them, you know, like the one I mentioned, rigida, probably pretty close. But for other ones, I don't think it's a significant factor
Okay.
because they're able to plug into almost any root they come in contact with. There's actually quite a literature about the root hemiparasitism in Castellaia, especially, well, and also in Triphoceria, very closely related genus.
Yes.
John Yoder has done huge numbers of papers on that topic. So that's an interesting one you can find a lot of information in the botanical literature concerning.
One more came in, and I'm going to allow it because I had this question also, because I went up to the White Mountains a couple of years ago. And have you decided what the Castellaia is in the White Mountains?
Oh, right. Yeah, I thought about putting another slide in for those, but for those that don't know what we're talking about, a few years back, Castellaia that grows in the high alpine in the White Mountains. Well, I guess there it's not even the high alpines. Its plants grow so far up the mountains there, but fairly high up is this gorgeous thing that's kind of pink, and it doesn't match any of the Castellaias found in California. It's very distinctive. But the thing is that it's not found anywhere except in that mountain range and in the presence of several other Castellaias that occupy that same exact habitat, particularly a high elevation form of Castellaia linearifolia and Castellaia nana. And this is in an area where Castellaia nana and its close relative pilosa come close to each other. And so it's, you know, there's also some disagreement, or at least head scratching, I would say more accurately, about whether it's actually nana or whether it's actually high elevation pilosa. But I think they're closer to nana. So anyway, these two very different Castellaias, one a little, you know, greenish yellowish thing that grows in the alpine and very squat and low growing, and then linearifolia, which is this large, brightly colored sagebrush related plant. And what we think is going on there is that these two are hybridizing. Larry Hickard pointed out that in the labs, he could cross very different Castellaias and come out with, you know, plants that grew this with viable seed from those hybrids. And this is probably a wild example of that, where because these plants grow together in the same place, and because they're sharing some of the same pollinators, that they form these hybrid plants that are intermediate between the two. And when you first look at them, you wouldn't say, well, this looks a lot like Castellaia nana, or this looks a lot like Castellaia linearifolia. But if you start looking at their characteristics, they're kind of intermediate between those two. And there are yet more Castellaias that occur in those meadows, like Applegatii is found up in there, but you don't find the characteristics of Applegatii, that the intermediates don't have wavy leaf margins. They have different kind of glandular hairs. The calyx structure is not that you find in Applegatii. So at least the working hypothesis is that these are hybrids between nana and linearifolia. Now there are planned genetics projects by folks at San Luis Obispo and also at the California Academy, who are working toward getting a genetic analysis of these plants. But with COVID and the field station up there being basically shut down last year, I believe,
Yes.
and I think this year as well,
Yes, I think
not
so.
much has happened up there. But I think the plants are still there, and you know, hopefully folks will get a chance to study the genes of them more thoroughly and find out if these hypotheses are correct. it's conceivable it could be an undescribed species. That's what I thought originally when I saw the specimens that Dylan Neubauer sent me and photographs. But having seen them in life and seen her collections from up there of the other species as well, in addition to the observations we made when we all went up there together in 2019, I think they're more likely, a hybrid swarm of some sort.
Okay. Well, I don't want to hold you too much longer because you deserve a nice nightcap after this. So there's some comments coming in on YouTube, but I will share them with you about finding that plant also in Convict Creek. So I'll let these people contact you. And how can people contact you if they have questions? Are you best available on Flickr?
Yes, if you just Google Mark Egger Castellaia on Flickr, you'll find my site, no doubt. And let's see. I'm also on iNaturalist. I don't post there because I like the way photographs come out on Flickr better, and I don't have the time to deal with posting both places. But I do wind up on iNaturalist almost every day, just curious about what's coming in and looking
I will
for.
post my pictures from Santa Rosa from April, and because I've put them on iNaturalist, and look forward to your feedback on those.
Right. Yeah. If you post them and I don't see them, or you don't notice me commenting on them within a day or two, just tag me on them, because no matter how carefully I scan those posts, there's just so many that come in that I'm realizing I'm missing more than I see, most likely.
Well, we appreciate you doing all this research. We appreciate all the time you spent with us tonight, because I know it was a major commitment, and your time is very valuable. So we really appreciate that, Mark. Thank you so much. And this is going to be just a great record of all your work that people can look at for a while.
All right.
So, but thank you very much. So Madeline, I'm going to hand it back. Is there anything else you wanted to say, or I'll just hand it back to our host?
Well, just thank you to everybody for the opportunity, and I hope to join you all back in California for great botany trips.
Hopefully you have a nice damp winter and we can really see some plants this year.
Yeah.
So,
all right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Well, just want to let everyone know that you want to save any information in the chat. If you go down at the bottom, those three dots will allow you to save the chat to your own computer. And thank you very much for hanging in there. Most of our talks do end at 9, and we hope to see you at future talks. So good night, all.
Hey, good night, everybody. I'm going to end the session now then. And thank you, Mark. That was an amazing talk.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around.